Alright, so for our next graph, we're taking it back to a one-cycle graph. Make sure the first thing you do is check to see if you're sketching 1 or 2 cycles. And let's start. So remember, we take this -4 at the end of the equation, and that is our first mark on our graph. And this is showing us where the parameters of our graph are going to be. So we mark the -4, and then we take this number at the front of the equation, and it tells us how much to go up and how much to go down. So we're going to go up 2 to -2, down 2 from -4 to -6. And these are the parameters of our graph. So next, we take this part, x minus pi over 4, and that's going to tell us where to make our first dot. So since this is negative, it's going to be the opposite, and it's going to be on the positive side of the graph. And we're going to say pi over 4 is right about here. We're going to make our first dot in the center of the graph lined up with -4 and pi over 4, and we're going to label it pi over 4, comma, -4. And that's our first dot. And now remember, since it's one cycle, we're going to find the width of our cycle with this equation, PB equals 2 pi. We're going to plug in this number for B, P times 7 over 2 equals 2 pi. And then we're going to divide each side by 7 over 2. And when you're dividing fractions, remember how to do it. You multiply by the reciprocal, so 2 over 1 times 2 over 7 equals 4/7 pi. And we take this number and add it to our first dot, so pi, or 1/4, plus 4/7. And when you're adding fractions, make sure the denominators match. So you get 7 over 28 plus 16/28 is equal to 23/28 pi, and that is going to tell us where dot number 5 is. So we're going to say dot number 5 is right about here. We're going to make our dot at 23/28 pi, comma, -4. So now that we have the length of our graph, the length of one cycle, we're going to make our middle dot right in between these two, and then check to see whether it's a positive or negative graph. Since it's negative, our first dot is going to be down here, and then our next dot is going to be up here, while keeping between -2 and -6. And then we're going to draw our wave. Okay, now our second sine graph is a little different, pretty much the same, but this time it says sketch 2 cycles, so we're basically going to make 2 waves. That's the only difference. So first, remember, we're going to start with this number, -4. We're going to make a line at -4, and then we're going to take our -5 at the front, and it tells us how much to go up and how much to go down. So we're going to go up 5 to 1, and down 5 to -9. And these are the parameters of our sine graph. And then next, we take this x plus 9 over 8 pi, and that tells us where to make the first point on our graph. So we're going to say 9/8 pi is right about here, and then we're going to make a dot lined up with the -4, and right in the center of our graph, and that is dot number 1. Now be sure to label it, and remember to pay attention to whether this is positive or negative, because it will change your graph. We're going to label our point. Now, we have to figure out where the first cycle of the graph ends. So we're going to take our equation, remember PB equals 2 pi. We're going to plug this number in for B again. P times 12/7 equals 2 pi. It's the same process that we did before. We get 14/12, which is equal to 7/6. And we're going to make our point right about... Actually, before we make our point, we have to take this new number, 7/6, and add it to our first point on the graph. So -9/8 plus 7/6. And remember, when you're adding fractions, the denominator has to be the same number. So and we get negative 27 over 24 plus positive 28 over 24, and we end up getting 1/24. So that's probably right about here, very close to here, and that is the end of our first cycle of the graph. And now, since it says 2 cycles, we have to find the next cycle length. So we're going to take this 1/24 right here, add another 28/24 over 24, because that's the same thing as the 7/6 we found up here. We get 29 over 24. And we're going to say that point is right about here. And so now that we have made both cycles, we can draw our graph. So remember, since this is one complete cycle, you're going to have a dot in the middle, and this is going to be its own wave. Now remember, pay attention to whether this is positive or negative. Since it's negative, instead of putting a dot up here first, we're going to put one down first, right here at -9. And then our next dot is going to be up here at +1, and then we're going to draw this wave or cycle of our graph. Now, same thing for the next cycle. Put a dot in the middle, and it's negative, so a dot down here. Then your next dot is up here, and then draw your wave. It's pretty simple. Alright, hi guys, so today we're going to be learning how to do sine graphs, and we're going to be learning how to do them with 1 cycle and 2 cycles later on. So the first step is to take this +3 right here, this number at the end of the graph, and we're going to start our graph. So with this number, that's the middle of our graph, so we're going to make a thing at +3, and then next we're going to take this number, and that number tells us how many to go up and how many to go down to create the parameters of our graph. So we're going to go up 4 to 7, +7, and down 4 from 3 to -1. So once we've done the parameters of our graph, we can start graphing our first dot, and this right here tells us where our first dot is. So pay attention to the positive and the negative signs right here, because that tells you if this point is on the positive side or the negative side of the graph. It is the opposite of what this is. So since this is x plus 6, 7 pi, this point will be on the negative side of the graph. So we're going to say it's right about here, and we're going to make our first dot in the center of our graph matched up with this point on +3. And then we're going to label it -6/7 pi, comma, +3, and that is our first point. So next we have to make sure the graph fits in its 1 cycle, and we have to make sure it's correct. So we use this equation to figure out where the cycle ends. PB equals 2 pi, and now we take this number right here and plug it in for B. So P times 3/4 equals 2 pi. Then you divide each side by 3/4, and when you're dividing fractions, you always multiply by the reciprocal. So 2/1 times 4/3 equals 8/3 pi. And now we have the length of 1 cycle. So we're going to make another point right about here and call that 8/3 away from 0. So make sure you label it. It's really important to label your first and fifth points. So 8/3 pi, comma, +3. And now we can create our 1 cycle of this sine graph. So what we're going to do, the next thing you do is you make a point directly in the center of both the points on your graph right now, and then you look and see if the graph is positive or negative. In this case, it's positive. So our second dot is going to be up, not down. And when you're making your dots, make sure you keep them within the parameters of your graph. So like this one is lined up with +7, and our next dot is going to be on the other side, down here, lined up with -1 to make a little wave. And that is our first sine graph. Okay, now finally, our last graph, we're back to a 2 cycle graph. So let's start. We're going to start with the -2, remember? Draw it right here, -2. And then this 7 up here is going to tell us how much to go up and how much to go down, just like we did before. So we're going to go up 7 to positive 5, and down 7 to negative 9. So now that we have the parameters of our graph, we're going to make our first dot. So how we make our first dot, remember, we take this x plus 15/7 pi, and since it's a positive, it's going to be on the negative side of our graph. Don't forget that this means the opposite. And we're going to say that's right about here. We're going to make our first dot at 15/7 pi negative 2. And make sure you label that. It's really important. So now we have our first dot. Now we need to find the length of the first cycle. So we're going to take this equation, PB equals 2 pi, and plug in this 3/4 in for B. So P times 3/4 equals 2 pi, divided by 3/4. And 2 over 1 times 4/3, because remember, when you're dividing fractions, you multiply by the reciprocal, and you get 8/3. So with this number, we're going to take it and add it on to this negative 15/7, negative 15 over 7 plus 8/3. Got to change that to negative 45 over 21 plus 56 over 21 to get the denominators equal. And to do that, all I did was multiply each side of this fraction by 3 and each side of this one by 7 to get the denominators to 21. So this equals 11/21 pi. And that's going to be where our first cycle of our graph ends. So I'm going to say that's right about here. So now we have our first cycle, but we'll draw the wave later. And now we got to figure out where our second cycle ends, since it's a 2-cycle graph. So we're going to take this 11/21 and add another 56 over 21 to it, which equals 67 over 21. That's a pretty big number, so we're going to say it's way out over here. And we're going to make this dot right here lined up with negative 2. So all of our dots are horizontal. Wait, they can connect to make a horizontal line, because they're all in the center of the parameters of our graph. So then we're going to label this, right? 67/21 pi, comma, negative 2. And now let's draw our two waves. So for this wave, this is one wave all on its own. So we're going to draw our center dot. Check to see whether the graph is positive or negative. It's positive, so our first dot goes up here, and our second dot goes down here. Now we're going to draw our first wave. Now our next wave, make a center dot right here. Remember, the graph is positive, so our first dot is up, and our second dot is down. And draw our second cycle, our second wave. And our graph is done. Thank you guys.